Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another one of the Insightflow Cafe events series. It's going to be a fun one tonight. Looking forward to this. I am Graham Ruddick. I am one of the co-founders of Insightflow. We've set up Insightflow as a set of tools to help improve the impact of research, to improve the speed and the efficiency of the production of research, and ultimately actually to connect researchers and business in much more fundamental and better ways to make research more deeply part of the business psyche. So that's us at Insightflow. I've got two brilliant guests this evening. Ron Sellers is a market researcher. Now, I've written down here for more than 30 years. In our introductory chat, he said for more years than he would care to admit to. So we'll split the difference between 30 and care to admit to. Ron is the president of Grey Matter, a market research agency with a truly spectacular pedigree. Their clients range from Coke to the women's professional soccer, and from the agency Interbrand to, delightfully, the American Pool Players Association. And I mean, in the briefing and the work up to this, it became very obvious, but I loved the quote, particularly about Ron. Ron's a consummate professional. His knowledge, expertise, and rapport with clients are unsurpassed, and I think that will come across very strongly. So good evening, Ron. Thank you very much for joining me.
Very glad to be here.
Richard Kimber, our other guest this evening, is another one who's been a market researcher for rather a long time, but possibly less time than Ron.
Just as grey.
Richard is the director at the CE Coach. His background is market research, but very much focused around the customer part of it and the customer and improving how customers are seen and used, are worked with and understood by business. Richard recently and interestingly qualified as a data scientist, so he absolutely represents the true nerd of the three of us.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Always.
It's true, though. It's true. It's true.
And Richard's also the author of the book, The Unforgettable Customer Experience. So do go and look that up. Thank you very much for joining, guys. Okay. Tonight we're going to be talking about data. I think anybody who's in research would understand and believe that data is the absolute oil of any research. It's the fundamental thing. And the idea of bad data, and I'm sure Ron will talk about some of his views around that as we go through. The idea of bad data is actually quite frightening to researchers, because it is the thing that says everything we do as researchers afterwards is based on the premise that the data we started with was right. And I think what we're going to discuss tonight is that's probably not true either much or most of the time, and we can discuss that one. And so we're going to have a look at what is bad data and what does bad data actually mean to researchers and ultimately to their business clients. We'll move on in the middle bit to talk about how we spot bad data and what it is we're looking at, whether we're looking at it in the data sets or in other habits and behaviors and what have you. And how can we spot it, and where is it our responsibility to be looking at the data we're using and saying, actually, this is bad data and we probably shouldn't use it. And then the third thing we'll look at is the more sort of upbeat side of it, is what can we do about it and whose responsibility is it? And also, I think in that last bit, there's probably an element of what is our duty to our customers to talk about it and talk about the potential of bad data. So let's just go back to the beginning and what are we defining as bad data? I'll ask you first, Ron. What are we defining as bad data in your view? What are you seeing as bad data?
You're going to start with the 30,000-foot view, huh? So to me, I guess bad data is anything that is not telling us the truth. And it may be bad because the source is not good. It may be bad because the collection methods were not good. It may be bad because the research itself was not good. Scales that don't work, or questions that are misleading, or things like that. Or just a questionnaire that's so stultifyingly boring and long that people zone out, and by the 17th 40 question grid, they're just clicking answers, right? So you've got lots and lots and lots of ways to get data that doesn't represent what the truth is. And when I say the truth, I'm talking about, when we're talking about sampling, we're talking about getting a tiny portion of a much larger sample universe, obviously, to go back to Research 101. So if the much larger universe, let's say 60%, would say that they're very satisfied with your product, and in your survey, you're getting 80%, you're getting 20%, whatever that may be, that's bad data. So it's research it's data that is not representative of what that sample universe is, or it can be that your sample universe is misdefined or is incomplete, and you're not actually getting the whole sample universe.
I mean, it was interesting you brought up in that this idea of the bad behaviors of the people who are being researched, the click on anything and what have you. I ran a website that for a long time had a staggering number of people from Afghanistan as members, until I realized that Afghanistan was the top left box in the select your country thing. And I think that is what you I mean, we'll come back to it, and then we'll come back to it in the question of what do you do about it. But I think I am particularly, among many of these, I'm particularly keen to talk about that idea of bad behavior, of people actually being researched possibly being researched in bad faith. Do you think that is a problem that is growing? Do you think that as we do more and more research online, there is a sense that people are a bit bored with doing research online and being participants in research online?
Well, it's not just online. It really comes from a variety of different factors to me, because you have some some participants who are outright fraudulent. Online panels have click farm problems, for instance. And certainly research is not the only thing that's being affected. I've seen statistics recently on how many Amazon reviews are completely fraudulent, right? How many different website reviews are completely fraudulent. And it's through click farms, and it's through bots and things like that. So you have bad behavior that is intentionally fraudulent. Yes, I'm only getting $1 from this survey in an online panel, but if I set up 700 cell phones, and each one of them is set up to where we're completing 50 surveys a day, that adds up pretty easily. That adds up pretty quickly, right? So you've got the intentionally fraudulent behavior, sometimes on a grand scale, sometimes on an individual scale, which is I set up 4 different accounts on the same panel, and now I'm just clicking through as fast as I can and answering things. That's basically the same behavior. It's just on a much, much lower scale, right? Much smaller scale. You've also got bad behavior that may not necessarily be related to the respondent. And that is, I'm going to answer your question in good faith. And let's even take this out of the world of online panel. We do a telephone survey. I'm going to answer your telephone survey in good faith. And I've got an interviewer whose accent I can barely understand, who has real difficulty reading the words. Everything sounds like this, no matter what the question is. And the questions are so long that by the time he's gotten to the end of the question, I don't even remember what the first part of the question was. And the topic's on something utterly irrelevant to me. You know what? Maybe I'm too polite to just say, this is ridiculous, and hang up. But I've checked out. I've completely checked out. Now, I entered that survey transaction in perfectly good faith. I was more than happy to do a survey for you. But then I told you, look, I've got to leave in 10 minutes. We're 20 minutes in, and I'm still bored to death by your survey. Now, whose fault is it that I'm now answering in bad faith? That's the researcher. And there's still an awful lot of bad research that is going on.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point. So, Richard, from the sort of more well, either the customer or the science side, where do you how do you define bad data in your world, and where are you seeing it? What have you?
So I say, and I don't disagree with anything Ron said. I say I would see bad data as really down at the sort of the literally individual data level. So certainly from a data science perspective, anything that you see in a data table or a data set that shouldn't be there is one thing. That is in the data set that doesn't conform in terms of format or style is maybe either numeric or non-numeric, and it shouldn't be. It should be the opposite. Where you've got missing values, you've got null values, and the data set is generally very inconsistent, and that can cause loads and loads of problems. One of the points I'd just like to build on that Ron was making was, well, a couple of things. It's that bad behaviour. I would agree to the point where poor quality research and poorly designed research induces bad behaviour. And that's a classic example that Ron's just used about, if you're going to expect customers in good faith to take part in a research programme, you need to be honest with them. And honesty about the length of the survey, that's really critical. Otherwise, you just, as Ron alluded to, you're just going to get people go, yes, no, 7-6, 7-6. And you might as well not have that data in the first place because it's pretty meaningless and or will skew results. I think just to touch on one of the other points that Ron made about, certainly when I was agency side and I left in 2011, even the market research industry at that point in time, and we're going back, 10 years now, over surveying customers was a big problem then. It's just got bigger and bigger with, every time you jump on a website or land on a website now, it's, can you just spare, a couple of minutes to give us your feedback? And it gets to the point where you just click no and off. And I think it's a shame because I think genuinely customers want to provide feedback as long as it's done in a quick, convenient, easy way for them and it doesn't waste their time, and that if it's done in that way, that's great. But again, I think in the market research industry as a whole, over surveying is a big problem, and it's not gone away, certainly even in the last 10 years. That in itself could create bad data. But yeah, I come at data from a very much more, let's look at the data set. What's the data set telling us? And it'll come on to, again, featuring in the next question when we talk about, so how do we spot it and then what do we do about it? But for me, that's where bad data sits.
And if I can, Graham, I'd like to
please.
just touch on something that Richard just said, because I think there are a couple of elements of it here. The over-surveying is a real problem.
Yeah.
And it's not just a problem for the research industry. It's a problem for the brand. Because one thing you don't want to do if you're an auto manufacturer, if you're a restaurant, if you manufacture shampoo, sorry, I should probably use a more relevant example, Graham. If you're manufacturing shaving equipment, okay, you don't want to tick your customers off. And if every time you go to the ATM, you get a follow-up call or follow-up email, how is our service? At some point, you as the brand are just annoying me as the customer. But the other part of that, I agree when Richard is talking about it should be a relatively quick, it should be a relatively infrequent, but it also is really important that it's relevant. Because as a customer who has had a less than stellar experience, there is nothing more frustrating than getting a follow-up survey and thinking, oh, good, I get to give some feedback. I get to help them be better. And then nothing whatsoever in that questionnaire addresses any of the negative things that I experienced or gives me an opportunity to provide that feedback. Basically, you've just said, hey, I really am interested in what you're saying. I really want. I mean, that's what you've just done to the customer, right? So when you do bad research like this with customers, don't think that we as researchers are the only ones who are suffering from this. And it's just poor us, it's making our job harder. It is hurting your brand.
Yeah.
Sorry, as you were speaking there, Ron, I was thinking about all the brilliant, I'm sure many people watching you speak or listening to you speak would think about all the fantastically inappropriate NPS questions that we seem to get these days. You bought a light bulb the other day. Would you recommend this light bulb to your family and your friends? Sorry. That's
it's a good point you raised, Graham. And you know, we could spend a whole other hour talking about, you know, inappropriate use of Net Promoter or over frequent use of Net Promoter, but it is a very good point.
Yeah. And I don't think this is going to be a particularly long part of the conversation, but do we believe as a panel that bad data basically invalidates all the research conclusions, the hypotheses, and the reporting and the what have you that comes after that? Richard, you're looking pensive.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's a really good question. I think it depends would be my answer, and it depends to what extent the view that there is of the degree of bad data. Certainly from a customer satisfaction and loyalty questionnaire perspective, we used to, so anybody that had not fully completed a questionnaire would be taken out of the analysis, you know, because it's just going to skew the numbers a little bit. Where you've got, you know, I don't know, 150 people have answered like 20 out of 20 questions, but then 50 people have only answered 10. So as an agency, we used to take those incomplete questionnaires out. So then you can be more certain, and certainly from a trust and a robustness and a client confidence in the work you've done for them, that you can stand in front of a board and you can say, you know, we are 100% confident that this is accurate, robust, reliable, because this is how we've processed it and how we've treated it. So to recap, yeah, so it depends is the answer.
But to sum up what you've actually said, what you said is take out the bad data and then the research becomes valid and what have you. So which is
and again, just the other thing I'd add on, especially doing, you know, satisfaction and loyalty research, is what you're actually trying to understand is people's perceptions of experiences, where they don't actually understand their own perceptions of their own experiences. So they're going to tell you what they best think is right. And in reality, that might not be right. But you've just got to accept that's part of researching or conducting research with human beings, because we are fallible and we're not, you know, we probably spend more time writing our weekly shopping list than we do thinking about, so what are my perceptions about what I've just experienced? So we just, you know, and we like to fill the void. Somebody asks us a question, whether we really know the answer or not, we'll tell them. But we invariably tell them what we think they want to hear, rather than this is an accurate reflection of my experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And in fact, one of the things you said resonated with something that Ron was telling us earlier in the week about this idea of doing tests to establish somebody's concentration. And I think you said that people were cheerfully confessing to use a made-up brand of software or something like that in the example you were talking about there, Ron.
I'm trying to remember exactly what we were talking about, but I mean, people are very human, they're very fallible, and they're very, very good at some things. In my experience, people, whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative research, they're very good at giving you their opinions, assuming they know anything about the topic that you're talking about, right? If you asked me about the House of Lords right now and the political composition, I can't tell you anything meaningful. I just don't know anything about it. That may not stop me from talking about it and trying to demonstrate my ignorance. And as Richard said, people will try to fill the void, especially in qualitative, right? People don't like to admit, I really don't know anything about that. I really don't understand anything about that. But if you ask people their opinions, they're really good at giving you their opinions. They're really bad at predicting future behavior.
Absolutely.
So, you know, when you say, how likely are you to make a gift to XYZ organization in the next 12 months? It costs them nothing to say, sure, very likely. When it comes time to actually pull out their wallets, suddenly that likelihood is going to go way down. But people, it costs nothing to say, I'm very likely to do this, I'll definitely vote, etc. So people also don't have the kind of memories that we would like them to have. And this applies to both good research and bad. It applies to good research in that when we talk about, like, I will ask a question, over the past 12 months, approximately how much money have you donated to nonprofit organizations or charities? All right. Now, most people will be able to tell us if let's say I'm talking to somebody who gave $683.14 or 683 pounds or whatever. They're not going to be able to tell me that number. they probably are going to know they didn't give 20 or 50. They're probably going to know they didn't give 3,000 or 5,000 or 10,000. So I'm going to get an estimate. And as long as I know that's what I'm getting and I'm comfortable that I'm getting that and I can treat the data accordingly, that's fine. Because I will still get some very big differences between the kinds of people who are giving 20 or 50 or 80 and the kinds of people who are giving 2,000 or 3,000 and 8,000. So that's a very valid use of the questionnaire. But then when people will take that data and start building these complex, complicated projective models, now we start having problems, right? Because you're taking what we know to be fairly broad estimates and turning them into exact data points that are meant to project something. And so the data, even though the research is being done properly, the data is being used wrong. And therefore it becomes, by the researcher's fault, bad data, misleading data, right? Having nothing whatsoever to do with the quality of the respondent, the quality of the questionnaire, anything like that. But then it's exacerbated when you have bad research. I think about a questionnaire that I got as a respondent that literally asked me the last time I put gas in my car to tell them the price to the penny. And it's specified to the penny. I had another lengthy questionnaire. I used to do a phenomenal amount of travel for business, 50,000 miles a year at least. And so I'd be renting cars all over North America. And I didn't have a predilection for it's got to be Hertz or it's got to be budget or anything like that. I go wherever the deal was best. And so I got one questionnaire that asked me over the last 12 months to list every city in which I'd rented a car, what the model of car was, what the agency was, what the price per day was, whether I had all these extras, did I buy the insurance, did I buy the Sirius XM package, did I pick it up on airport, off airport, it was literally, I'm supposed to I had just gotten back from someplace. I couldn't remember who I rented from in Atlanta, what I just flew in from, right? So we exacerbate that lack of memory by asking people things that are utterly impossible for them to answer. And then we take that data and we put it into these projected models. So now instead of using estimates to get exact numbers, we're using pure imaginary nonsense to create these numbers and then basing marketing and strategy plans on this stuff.
Yeah, well, Richard, I see you nodding away to that.
Yeah, I completely, there's some complete nonsense in research sometimes, just pure out and out. That's just insanity. Just the other point I wanted to touch on, going back to, I think something that Ron said right at the beginning, is certainly sort of running my own business over the last sort of 7-8 years or so, and working with sort of large organizations, is one of the other sources of bad data I see is what should be a single version of the truth, which is rarely a single version of truth. Data comes from different systems and tells you different things. And as a result of that, there is a high degree of mistrust to the point where we don't know which system's right, so let's not use either. Yeah, but surely one of them must be right. And I've found it quite illuminating working with organizations where nobody knows which source of data is right because it conflicts. Customer records are a great example. So in one system it says that, in another system it says that, and they don't match. Well, why don't they match? And nobody can tell you the answer. So, and then that almost becomes, well, I can't do anything with that unless you guys decide internally which is a single source of truth, which you just agree it. Then we can move on and we can do something about it. And I've seen that time and time again. I don't know, Ron, if that's your experience.
Well, I don't work with the kind of customer data that you work with unless it's something that we're appending as part of a survey process. And then, the numbers are much smaller. But I see that all the time with conflicting survey results. I'll give you an example. I mentioned I've done a lot of work in nonprofit and faith-based. And so in the US, which is where most of our work has been done, evangelicals evangelical Christians are a significant portion of the population. And we see vastly different survey results purporting to report what evangelicals are doing or buying or believing or anything like that. Well, there are there are now four main research definitions of evangelicals. And depending on which company you believe and develop them, they represent 7% of the US population, 25% of the US population or 40% of the US population. So now, I don't care whether we're talking about a religious definition, an ethnic definition, a loyal customer definition. You tell me a group may represent 40% or may represent 7%, and then you give me data, and then don't even tell me what the definition that you used is. This is just our loyal customers. Well, that's great. Customer satisfaction may determine our loyal customers are one definition. Marketing may have a totally different definition that is triple what customer satisfaction area says. And now the surveys are reporting completely different things. And I've seen, for instance, I saw a survey from a very well-respected health organization saying sexual activity among single evangelical young adults was no different in frequency or amount or anything like that than among non-evangelicals. And that struck me as odd. And we had an opportunity to work with an organization where we used a very definite definition of evangelical, a much more narrow definition. And we found dramatic differences between sexual activity according to religious belief, dramatic differences. But they had used an extremely broad, really meaningless definition, but it's very easy to ask. And so they use that big 40% are evangelicals. And this is people that haven't darkened the doors of a church in 40 years, but they use some kind of a term to describe themselves. They decide, okay, that's evangelical. When we actually looked at it according to religious beliefs and participation, dramatic difference in sexual activity. So, but the two were, by the outside world, both are surveys of evangelicals. And so the research just has to be wrong. And unfortunately, yes, one of the studies was very wrong, but now ours and everybody else's is going to get painted with the same broad brush.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I'll just interject and say, please do use the Q&A for questions for these guys as you go through. And if you do ask questions, I will try and insert them into the conversation as we go through. So we'll move on now to the second stage. Now, what I said at the beginning is how can we spot it? But I think actually we've probably given quite enough examples as we've gone through about spotting it and seeing it and recognizing bad data. But do you think that there's a process or a way of thinking that researchers should go through when they start to look at data, the sets of questions they should ask about perhaps where it came from or what have you? Yeah, Richard, do you think there's a kind of hygienic set of activities that a researcher should go through when looking at data for the first time, or setting up research to try and mitigate the existence of bad data or take it out?
Yeah, and again, it's a really good question, Greg. So I've got a couple of thoughts on that. It's certainly when I was at the agency, we would, and it starts with managing client expectation up front in terms of these are the data fields we're going to need from you, Mr. Client, in terms of, and if you can't get any of those, you know, then we need to have a discussion very, very quickly and very early on in the project and the process. And then once we've got a data set from a client, we used to just sanity check it. So have they given us what we asked for, which is just a common, you know, yes, no, if they, you know, and what does the data set look like in terms of accuracy and quality? And what I would probably do in the second part of my answer is lean much more on the data science approach in terms of, you know, data science has got a really sort of sexy, in inverted commas, perspective, I think, on things. That most of the data science that I've experienced is not that. It's literally wrangling data, I think, is one of the phrases that is quite common in the sort of in the industry, and it is just that. So it's looking at, you know, going through what I would call an exploratory data analysis process. So you are literally getting stuck in, getting your hands into the data set. So what have I got here? You know, if you're looking at, you know, I've done data modeling with 250,000 lines of data, you know, it starts to get a little bit messy with stuff like that. But you need to understand what it is you've got in your data set. And you can do that through like looking at descriptive statistics. You can do some exploratory data analysis in terms of, you know, have I got a series of mixed fields? Have I got numerical? I've got alphanumerical. Have I got characters? Have I got null spaces? Have I got, you know, characters in there that I really don't need? So that going through that exploratory data analysis process, A, highlights it, and B, it allows you to do a lot of data transformation that gets you from point A, which is a messy data set, to point B, which is a usable data set. But there can be quite a lot of physical manipulation through that process to get you to a point where, because if you can't get through that point, you've a data set you can't use.
Sure. And I mean, you're obviously talking about big data sets and often the sort of the result of quant thinking, at least, if not quant research. Do you think that that sort of data science approach and thought process applies equally to qual data, which is obviously generally a much smaller data set, but much more nuanced and result of conversations and so forth?
Yes, I do, Graham. And I think it gives you, certainly in the sort of data science work that I studied, the exploratory data analysis process it's quite clear and robust. And there are, 5-6 steps to follow, which is quite logical and can be, you could apply it to any data set, irrespective of, whether you're in data science or whether you just, sat as part of a research team and you're a data analyst.
Sure. Okay,
so I just think, we could put, and that's probably something that research, and maybe a bit of a generalization, that research could apply a little bit more rigor to, in terms of when we get a data set, let's go through a series of steps to ensure that, we've got, if we have to do any additional manual preparation or, transformation, then we can get that done. And that's where the level of confidence for me starts, in terms of before we even go into any analysis, that we know we're confident with the data set we're using.
Excellent. So, and what about you, Ron? Do you think there's advice you can give in terms of basic processes that somebody should ask when being given data or when asking for data, or what have you?
Probably the smartest decision of my entire career has been when I decided that I was going to look at every data set, and that includes qualitative data, survey data, customer data from the client, everything else. I was going to look at every data set with the assumption that it's complete and utter garbage, that it's wrong, until I could prove to myself that it was right. If you start, and then when I started assuming that it was all wrong, that freed me up tremendously, because now number one, I had to work to prove it to myself that it was right. And then I also started thinking, what are all the ways this could be wrong? So, just a very quick example. We did a survey for a large organization with a lot of employees. That was a nonprofit organization, and this was among their donors. So they gave us their donor database, and I told them specifically not to include this type of person, this type of person, this type of person, et cetera, because those were outliers, and we wanted to talk to the primary donors. And one of the things that I told them is, don't include any of your own employees who actually give, because that's a very different type of donor than the average donor out there, right? That's an external person. And we really don't want to change anything based on the employees. We're a very captive audience. Yeah. We want to look at the customers, right? And so they gave me the data set. We surveyed people, got a great response rate, and I'm starting to look at some of this stuff and going, I'm really surprised by this. Really? And so some of the stuff, just because I'm assuming it's wrong. And so I'm looking and thinking, okay, I know this is wrong. I know something is wrong with this data, the survey data. What's wrong? And so I started digging and digging and digging. And it's like, the questions were good. The response rate was good. And as I really dug into it, I found, although I had told them, do not give me employees, they gave me employees. The response rate among the consumer donors was, 10, 12%, something like that. Among employees, it was 50%. So now, although employees represented this much of their donor base, it was this much of the survey base. Completely skewed sample. Now, all I had to do was just toss those people from the survey, or actually, I separated them, looked at them separately. But because I assumed it was wrong, and I spent so much time trying to prove to myself that it was right, I found stuff that was wrong. And I found a way that a client surprised me that the data was wrong. Now, the research itself had been done flawlessly. right? Because I did the research, I can say stuff like that. So no, but I mean, it was done. It was done the way it should have been done. Nothing is ever perfect, but it was done well. But I was still getting stuff that just didn't make sense. And so I approach it as everything is wrong until I prove to myself this is right. And that has saved my bacon more times than I can possibly tell you. And that it's the same thing with qualitative data, right? People will tell me things and I'll say, that just doesn't pass the smell test. And so now, as the moderator, it's time to dig a little bit. And then I found out, oh, what they really meant was this, right? And so, and sometimes I think something doesn't pass the smell test, and I dig, and the person becomes even more dug in and more adamant that, yes, that's exactly how I do things. And you do have to realize there are outliers out there. The example that I gave, I used to work with a very statuesque, tall, broad-shouldered female coworker, and she looked fantastic in men's double-breasted suits. And so she shopped almost exclusively at a major chain, Men's Warehouse. Now, if you do a customer survey, I mean, what it probably would represent maybe 0.5% who are like that. But if you do focus groups, first of all, the recruiting is not going to be representative. Let's say you get 2 of those people in your room full of 8 people. I'll ask our data scientists what percentage that was. It's certainly not 0.5%, right? So now you've got a completely skewed sample. So you've got to think about stuff like this when it comes to qual, which has some of its own special needs in terms of data quality.
Yeah. Yes. So I mean, that feels to me like a really good set of advice from both views to the people who are watching, listening. And then just to lift it up, just to the other level. We're all grown-ups. What do we do about bad data? How do we get through? I mean, I've got a list here, listening to you talk, a list of 8 or 9 areas you've talked about that cause bad data. I mean, we won't necessarily go through all of those, but if you think of what we've heard is behaviors, bad research design, over surveying, not relevant, customers tell lies, the definition of the data and the misuse of the data and what have you, are all things that you've said. So against the background of all sorts of ways it could go wrong, what do we do about it? How do we advise ourselves and our own business, or how do we in our own businesses sort out, or how do we advise our clients to approach the issues of bad data creation? I mean, there's plenty of other stages thereafter. So where would you start, Richard, if you're looking in your data science hat at a fistful of bad data?
It's a really good question, and I think it's a really big challenge these days. The amount of data that's being produced on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis, it's gone exponential. It's been exponential for a while, and that in itself is causing massive amount of issues. I guess certainly in the conversations I have with people around data is I don't think anybody's under the illusion that anybody's data sets are perfect. I think maybe if you went back 20 years, I think people were a bit more naive about data and the use of data, and I don't think they necessarily understood, the type of data the organization produced, where it's at, who had access to it, what the quality of it was like, and good, bad, and indifferent. I think people, whilst the problem hasn't gone away, I think generally speaking, certain clients I've worked with and people that speak to in organizations recognize that it's a problem and a challenge to be solved, but they can't necessarily or aren't able to solve the problem. So I think just having a conversation with clients and with contacts about what do you think is the quality of your data, and if we took a sample of a data set, how accurate would it be, and would we be able to use it? And it's just having that grown-up conversation, I think, about it. I think the classic, certainly in some of the work that I do around sort of customer satisfaction and sort of loyalty measurement, is it starts with, you always need a customer database. You need a list of customers that you're going to survey, and Ron, you'll probably know this all too well. The quality of that data is very much dependent upon the people that use a CRM system. And it's either what you tend to get is invariably it's either customer services or sales account managers or new business teams that use CRM, because that's where it should have its value. Certainly I've come across that there's no real clear guidance and rules in terms of what we're going to fill in and where. You can't make everything mandatory, because then nobody would bother to do it. So you could make some stuff mandatory, but then that still doesn't, if we come back to the point we raised earlier on about behavior, you've got internal behavior about salespeople don't get paid for filling in CRM systems. It's part of the job, yes, but they're not incentivized on it and they're not bonused on the accuracy of it. So that's where it sort of starts. So certainly with the satisfaction projects that I work with clients, my first, or part of the conversation we have is let's do a data extract, then let's send it to the sales teams, get the sales teams to validate it, because they own the customer, so they should own the customer data. So that's very much, and I've not experienced personally any pushback on that. So that's sort of really where it sort of starts in terms of the conversation.
Excellent. So this idea of actually making data ownership clear and giving them a say about it and what have you. I've certainly been in businesses that resemble that world of lots and lots of data that doesn't connect or make sense.
And I just think, just to add to that, Graham, sorry to interrupt, I was on a webinar a couple of months, maybe not even a couple of months ago, maybe about a month ago, around the whole topic of data governance. And it's still quite a relatively new discipline in corporate organizations. And I've not come across that many sort of data governance leaders. It sits somewhere, but organizations haven't got a really strong grip on that. And I think that would help massively.
Cool. And from your point of view, Ron, again, looking at how do we improve data quality, and you're talking, I think, a lot more of the time about smaller amounts of data coming in from the outside.
Right.
How, from your point of view, and looking at that sort of thing, what would you advise? What would you be saying to people who are effectively buying that data?
Make a list of all the possible things that can go wrong, and check every one of those. So, for instance, 20 years ago, when customer databases often didn't include email addresses, we would be asked to do a customer survey or a donor survey or some kind of a constituent survey. And I'd say, okay, is this something that can be done by phone or done by email? They'd say, well, 40% of our records have email, so we've got plenty to do a survey. It's like, okay, time out. It's not a matter of we have plenty to do a survey. What's the difference between the 40% you have records for and the 60% you don't? Well, we only started collecting email addresses 3 years ago with new incoming customers, so that'll be all of our new customers. Oh, okay. So now if I do an email survey with this, or an email invitation to an online survey, basically what I'm doing is I'm taking your most recent 3 years of new customers and saying that represents all of your customers, including the ones who've been with you for 30 years. Data skew, anybody? I mean, it's, and that's one of the things in the survey world that so many people are concerned with. Well, this survey is 5,000 respondents, so this is 400. So obviously this survey is right. What's 400 going to do? Well, this survey of 5,000 was a convenience sample. That's in no way, shape, or form representative. This 400 was done scientifically. It's representative. It's validated. Your 5,000 is meaningless. It's garbage data. My 400 is meaningful. Okay. Never, when you see something that looks odd, never say, I didn't expect that, and move on. Investigate it. 20% of my customer data that I got to do this survey is missing the net present value. Why is that? Oh, those are our really high level customers, and we don't do net present value on that because it's so obvious they're worth a lot to us. They buy $300,000 worth of goods a year. So we don't, net present value is ridiculous. We're not going to take the time. Okay, so now we have net present value for only our less valuable customers. It's not representative again. Another way that data can be skewed is through response bias. Women are more likely to respond to surveys than men are. So I send a survey invitation out to customers, and I find that 60% of my respondents are women. Well, I want to compare that to the database, because it very well may be I got a perfectly unbiased response, And it's 60% are females because that's 60% of the customers. And that's exactly what it should be. But if 60% of the customers are men, now again, data skew because of the response bias. And that's not just based on gender, that's based on, like with nonprofits, the larger donors, the longer term donors, the more engaged donors, or with for-profits, the more engaged, more loyal customers are the ones more likely to respond to a survey. So now, unless you are doing something to compare your data with existing known parameters, you're doing a survey of your most loyal, happiest customers. That doesn't do much to determine customer satisfaction, right? So every step of the way, and when we're talking about, I've talked mostly about database kind of surveys. We're talking about going out to the general public. The most common way of doing that is through using online panels. Those are used worldwide. We regularly are throwing out 40 to 50% of the respondents we get in online panel surveys as complete, unmitigated garbage. They're fraudulent. They're not even real people. They're bots or click farms. The ones who are real people are lying through their teeth about everything. They're clicking, I do everything. In the last 12 months, I've gotten a tattoo, I've gone bankrupt, I've dated a supermodel, and I've done all these different things because that's what'll qualify me for the survey, right? And so, I mean, we have seen, and you have to prepare for that in advance. So we put in all kinds of traps and quality measures into the survey itself, into the questionnaire itself, and into the programming. And it's astonishing to me. We did a study called More Dirty Little Secrets, Still More Dirty Little Secrets of Online Panels. And we worked with a large field service, Harman Research, on this. And one of the things we did was we said, okay, these are some of the traps and quality measures we're going to use. And we talked with Harman and we said, what proportion of the clients you're working with are using these? And then we did the same thing with a large field center that wasn't involved, and we got validation that Harman's estimates were pretty much what this other company was using. 25% of clients that are doing panel surveys don't do anything to evaluate the verbatims on open ends for bogus responses beyond obvious gibberish, things like, just typing in KKKKKKK. But if you ask a question about how satisfied were you with your new car purchase, and the answer is, this is my family's favorite brand, well, there's a disconnect there. So that may not be a 100% measure that that's a bad respondent, but it's a signal. There's something that needs to be looked into further. 50% don't eliminate straight liners, which are people who just click agree strongly or very familiar. 90% don't do anything to track respondents' time spent on individual questions. 90% don't do what we do, which is go line by line through the data looking for problematic or duplicate responses. 95% don't include fake brands or fake names in awareness questions. So, I mean, researchers are doing very, very little to capture and eliminate these fraudulent and bogus or just disinterested respondents. And as a result, 40, 50% of the data you're getting is just garbage. It's just fraud. But they're not doing anything about it. So, and you can't just look at the results and say, let's go through and find these bad people. You've got to create systems that will let you look at the results and say those people are bad.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. It's somewhat scary listening to you talk there, especially in a world where I know that people are absolutely using more and more online panels and panels as their core routes of research. So we've had a question in. So one question to you both, and I'll go to you first, Richard. But so the question is, to help deal with bad data, should you actively look for different data sources that might corroborate the same findings? So basically, if there's one data source that's not good, or you think it might be dodgy, or even just it will be dodgy, do you actually go and find something to cross-fertilize or cross-relate with it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I guess I've maybe got a couple of answers to that. For me personally, I guess it depends what you're measuring. or what you're trying to understand. And it may be that there is a possibility to corroborate it or to cross sort of reference it to see if you can substantiate, I guess, where that's possible. If it doesn't, does that raise more questions than it gives you answers for? And that's back to my earlier point about, conflicting sources of truth, and that there is no single source of truth. So, can we, if we ask that question, and we get the answer that we don't want or we don't like, what are we going to do about it? So it is back to that, and I've seen that regularly. We've got different systems, and they tell us different things about the same customers. That shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
So you've got that type of scenario, and I guess, that's a tough.
Yeah, and I suppose it does depend on content. And from your point of view, Ron, I mean, is there, you're talking about the big panel organizations and online panels and what have you. Is there any value in putting the same survey out through two separate organizations who might have the same level of faults but different ones? Do you think that would work in the panel world, Ron?
Well, one of the things we do and have for a long time is almost all of our consumer surveys that are done through panel are using a blend of panels, because they all have their own biases, even in how people are recruited. And it is a non-representative sample. It is not a random probability sample. So you can do everything you want in terms of balancing demographically, balancing psychographically, things like that. It will always be a non-probability sample. So it'll always be subject to those kinds of problems that you get in a non-probability sample. But we will, both in survey data and in customer data, part of the difficulty when you're comparing things is different definitions. I gave earlier the example of the 7% versus 40% versus 25% of evangelicals. But there are some things that are known factors, right? We know through very well-respected social science kind of research approximately what proportion of American adults give a gift to a nonprofit organization in the past 12 months. Now, even there are different definitions. Are churches considered nonprofit organizations or synagogues? Does a gift include gifts of stock, gifts in kind, things like that? So even there are different definitions. But there's some standardized information that we can look at and say, okay, we know 12% of the US population is African American. In my supposedly representative sample, I've got 4%. There's a problem. So if you've got a known quantity that you can compare to, then yes, you could absolutely compare and say, this is good, at least on this point, this data is good. This one is not so good. The problem comes in when somebody else did a survey and says that 60% of donors are not entirely satisfied with their donor experience with a nonprofit. Well, I don't know how the survey was done. I don't know how that was defined. I don't know any of this stuff. So now I'm trying to compare something to something that may be complete garbage, or it may be complete truth. And I have no way of knowing.
Yeah, I guess, yes. So another question just come in. I think this is a really interesting one, especially given the world we're in research. So the question is, does the proliferation of self-service research platforms like SurveyMonkey and what have you mean that because amateurs are setting up the research, they are likely to be getting worse data, more bad data?
And I'll answer that with a question. Does the proliferation of people doing work on their own homes mean that there are probably going to be homes with greater plumbing or electrical problems than when it was largely contractors doing that kind of work?
We'd have to do some research to find that out.
But just logically, I would say there are bad contractors out there, building contractors who are just very bad at their jobs. But there's licensing, there's people who are poor enough at their jobs, don't get future work, they get bad reviews, etc. So my guess is that the average professional building contractor is probably better at his or her job than the average DIY person. You have some DIYers out there, my father was one of them, who was as good as any contractor out there. He was as good as any auto mechanic out there. So he could do it himself very well. But then you have somebody like me, I'm competent to change the oil or put a new battery in my car. I am not competent to drop a new engine in a car. So I probably shouldn't be dropping a new engine in a car. And research is something that there are literally dozens and dozens of ways, some very big and some very nuanced, to completely screw up the project. And so the less experience you have at it, the less formal training you have in it, the less work you've done in it, the less corroboration you have with other experienced experts, the greater the chances that you're just not going to see one of those ways of screwing it up and fall victim to that. And that's not just the research world, that's in anything.
No, that makes complete sense. And from your point of view, Richard, and as a data scientist, dealing more with technology and what have you, do you feel that possibly the ease of access to technology is helping or hindering?
I think the ease of access to technology is helping, and I don't necessarily think that's where the issue is, because I think, certainly in my experience, people fall quite clearly into one camp or the other. You're either data literate and tech savvy, or you sort of can dabble a bit, but you'd pass it over to this camp rather than sort of hang on to yourself. So I think, and everybody can use Excel, but not everybody's an Excel wizard, right? So I think certainly with like customer research, I'd echo everything that Ron has just said. And in my experience of working agency side again, everybody thinks they can write a questionnaire and design it, which technically they sort of can. Doesn't mean it's a great questionnaire. Doesn't mean it doesn't break all the cardinal rules of questionnaire design to facilitate a really great piece of research. And I'm not having a pop at marketing when I tell this story, but typically what you find is if it's an organization that won't outsource, can't afford to outsource, or hasn't got any research professionals internally, the questionnaire design will start in marketing, because they want to know what impact marketing's having. And then what they'll do is they'll pass the questionnaire around to every other single department, and they'll add loads of questions on. There'll be no rigorous, analysis of it, and it'll just go, brilliant. And back to Ron's earlier point, what started as a succinct and punchy 5 to 10 minute questionnaire has grown into a 25-minute mega monster that is never going to elicit any credible data, even if you can get somebody to complete it. So just understanding the nuances of questionnaire design, what makes a good questionnaire from not a great questionnaire, that's straightforward, and that's giving it to professionals.
Yep.
And Graham, there's one quick point I'd like to make. Just because you do give it to professionals doesn't mean that it's going to get done right.
I knew you were going to say that.
To me, it's exactly the same thing as going to the doctor. If you go to the doctor and he says, you've got this condition and you need to change what you're doing and change your diet and do this, do that, and the other thing, and you just say, okay, and you walk away and you do all that stuff, you're not an informed consumer. No. If the doctor looks at me and says, you need to drop 20 pounds, I kind of go, okay, yeah, I know that. That's logical. I don't need a second opinion on that. But if the doctor says, hey, I need to start you on insulin because you're diabetic, I'm not just going to go, okay, give me the needles. I'm going to say, okay, can I see the test results? Well, where are the levels? Well, can I have it? Let me get another opinion on this, et cetera. And it's the same thing on research. One of the biggest mistakes that clients make is just hand it over to the researchers, whether that's an internal research person or that's a vendor, and say, well, that's the researcher, so I'm sure that's all going to be done properly. Well, from the stats that I just read you earlier, in terms of 95% aren't doing this and 90% aren't doing that, no, a lot of it's not being done properly, right? And I've seen some horrendous mistakes come out of professional researchers. So as the client, as the end client, don't just take the data that you're given and say, this is the God's honest truth and there's nothing I can do about it. Have the researcher prove to you that the data was done right, that fraudulent respondents were not allowed in your questionnaire, or that they were removed from the data set. Spend time necessary to get that second opinion, or to hold the doctor's feet to the fire and say, why do you say this? Rather than just say, oh, okay, I have diabetes, and change your life.
I think actually that's a wonderful note on which to stop this. But they get the researchers to prove the data was right feels to be an underlying truth across the whole conversation in the last hour. Thank you. It's been a wonderful hour. We've learned in a scientific research project of one from a data scientist that data science is profoundly sexy, and we've learned in a scientific research project, a research pool of one research company president, that their work is flawless. I'm sure that there's no bad data in that whatsoever.
No, of course not.
Thank you very much, guys. I thoroughly enjoyed that. That hour seemed to go by incredibly quickly. And certainly I found it fascinating and really interesting. For those of you in the audience who were listening, have any more questions, get in touch with these guys through our site, or they are all findable. We will be producing a video of this, and we'll get that out at some point in the next couple of weeks. But it leaves me to say, have a wonderful evening, everybody. And Richard, Ron, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.
Cheers. Good night, guys.
Take care.